The dying child's scream shattered the sacred ceremony like a stone through glass. Young Prince Edward, who moments before lay unconscious with fever in his chambers, burst through the great hall doors, his small body trembling, skin pale as death itself. The massive oak doors crashed against the stone walls with a sound like thunder, their iron hinges shrieking in protest. Before anyone could stop him, before his father's guards could even comprehend what they were seeing, he lunged at his sister Aethelflaed, tearing the ancient crown from King Alfred's hands as it descended toward her head. "Not her," the boy cried, blood trickling from his nose in dark, crimson streams that stained his white sleeping gown. "The gods showed me not her. The crown, that ancient circle of gold and silver, worn by Saxon kings since the days when Rome still ruled the world, clattered across the stone floor. It rang out like a bell, spinning past nobles in their finest ceremonial robes, past warriors with hands frozen on their sword hilts, past priests clutching their holy books, past advisors who had spent months planning this very ceremony. The crown rolled and bounced, leaving scratches in its wake across stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, until it stopped at the feet of a Danish servant woman with dark hair and haunted eyes. But Edward wasn't finished. The fevered child, who should have been too weak to stand, who by all rights should have been dying in his bed with physicians hovering over him, pulled himself across the floor. His father's advisors stood frozen in horror, their mouths open in silent shock. His sister Aethelflaed reached for him with trembling hands, her own coronation gown pooling around her like a lake of silk and gold thread, tears streaming down her face as she watched her baby brother crawl like a wounded animal. "Edward, please," she whispered, but the boy didn't seem to hear her. He grasped the crown with both small hands, hands that shook with fever and something else, something that looked terribly like divine purpose. With strength that should have been impossible for his ravaged body, he lifted it toward the servant woman the court knew as Brida, a Danish captive taken years ago during Uhtred's raids along the northern borders. She stood there in her simple grey servant's dress, her hands stained with kitchen work, her face a mask of confusion and rising terror. "Her," Edward whispered, his voice carrying impossible authority that echoed through the suddenly silent hall. Every person present felt the weight of that single word, felt it settle into their bones like prophecy. "The gods crowned her in my dream. She is father's daughter. She is my sister. She is the one." As the crown touched Brida's dark hair, impossible golden light blazed from the ancient metal, a radiance that had not been seen since the days of the first Saxon kings, since the time when God still walked among men and blessed the worthy with signs no mortal could forge. The light filled the hall, brighter than 100 torches, painting shadows that danced like living things across the walls. The hall erupted. Nobles shouted in outrage. Warriors drew their swords with the ring of steel on steel. Priests clutched their crosses and began muttering prayers against witchcraft and demon possession. But before we witness how this impossible moment reshapes a kingdom, before we see fathers confront their sins and sisters accept their fates, before we watch as crown and destiny realign themselves according to plans laid by powers beyond mortal understanding, let me take you back 2 years earlier. Back to the night King Alfred made a choice that would doom or save his bloodline, to the secret buried so deep that even he had convinced himself it never happened, to the moment when passion and politics collided in a darkened chamber while his wife slept in rooms far away. This is the story of how a dying child's vision exposed a king's greatest sin and revealed a kingdom's truest heir. This is the story of Brida, the servant who was more than she seemed, the daughter who didn't know her father, the queen who would rise from ashes and kitchen fires. This is the story of how destiny, once set in motion, cannot be denied, not by kings, not by kingdoms, not even by the gods themselves. King Alfred the Great stood before his assembled court with the weight of England upon his shoulders and death's shadow creeping ever closer through his veins. The great hall of Winchester blazed with torchlight that did little to warm the autumn chill seeping through the ancient stones. He had called his most trusted advisers, his greatest warriors, the bishops who prayed for his soul, and the nobles who would shape England's future after he was gone. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the oak table before him, not from weakness alone, but from the magnitude of what he was about to declare. I name my daughter, the Lady Aethelflaed, as heir to the throne of Wessex and protector of all Saxon lands. His voice, once commanding enough to rally armies and cow Danish warlords, now rasped like wind through dead leaves. She has proven herself in battle and in wisdom. She has defended Mercia when men twice her age cowered behind walls. She will unite our kingdom and lead us into an age of... A commotion erupted from the eastern corridor. Physician Aelwyn burst through the doorway, his robes askew, his face ashen with terror. "My lord, king!" He burns like fire itself. He speaks in tongues we cannot understand. The physician's voice broke. "My lord, I fear we are losing him." Alfred's composure shattered like ice beneath a hammer. He moved toward the door with surprising speed for a man so ravaged by illness, his advisers scrambling to follow. Aethelflaed gathered her skirts and ran after her father, her face pale but determined. The nobles murmured among themselves, uncertainty spreading through the hall like poison in water. In the shadows near the servants' entrance, Brida watched it all with eyes as cold and dark as a winter sea. She had been refilling wine pitchers when the king made his announcement, her hands steady, her face carefully blank in the way all good servants learn to wear. But inside, behind the mask she'd perfected over 2 years of servitude, hatred burned with a heat that rivaled any fever. Alfred the Great, Alfred the Pious, Alfred the Wise, the man who had ordered the raid that killed her mother, who had taken her from her village in chains, who had placed her in his household like a trophy of war. She watched him stumble through the doorway, heard the fear in his voice for his dying son, and felt nothing but grim satisfaction. Let his precious boy die. Let this great king feel the same agony she had felt when Saxon swords cut down everyone she loved. She moved through the dispersing crowd like smoke, unnoticed, unremarkable. Other servants rushed to their duties, some to prepare hot water and clean linens for the prince's chamber, others to fetch priests for last rites, still others to begin the whispered preparations for what might come next. Brida followed at a distance, drawn by something she couldn't name, some compulsion that pulled her toward the prince's chambers as surely as iron to lodestone. The corridor outside Edward's room filled with nobles and clergy, all pressing close, all desperate for news. Through the gaps between their bodies, Brida caught glimpses of the scene within. The small prince thrashed on his bed, his skin glistening with sweat, his young face twisted in agony or ecstasy, she couldn't tell which. Alfred knelt beside him, holding the boy's burning hand, his own face wet with tears. Aethelflaed stood at the foot of the bed, her lips moving in silent prayer. Then Edward's eyes snapped open, and Brida felt a chill run down her spine despite her hatred. The boy's eyes had changed. They no longer held the warm brown of childhood, but blazed with an otherworldly golden light that seemed to see through flesh and stone and time itself. His small body went rigid, his back arching off the bed, and when he spoke, his voice carried the resonance of something far older and far more terrible than any 9-year-old child should possess. "The crown lies," Edward whispered, his words cutting through the hushed chamber like a blade. "The heir is hidden. The true daughter watches from shadows, wearing the chains of the conquered. 2 years earlier, the night had been thick with smoke and screams. Brida remembered the way her village burned, how the thatch roofs of Danish settlements along the border had lit the sky like a second sunrise. She had been 17 then, daughter of a Danish trader who had settled in the borderlands, seeking peace between two worlds. That peace died with Saxon steel and English fire. She remembered running through the chaos, her mother's blood still warm on her hands, when strong arms caught her from behind. A tall man in fine armor, his face hidden by shadow and smoke, dragged her away from the burning ruins. She fought like a wildcat, clawing and biting, until he struck her hard enough to make stars explode behind her eyes. When she woke, she was in chains in Winchester's dungeon, just another Danish captive waiting to be sold or killed or forgotten. But King Alfred the Great had other plans. He came to the dungeons 3 days after the raid, walking among the prisoners like a shepherd inspecting his flock. His eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that men called wise, had lingered on her face. This one, he told his captain, clean her up, put her in the kitchens. She's young enough to forget her old loyalties and learn English ways. What followed should never have happened. A king should have been above such base desires, should have kept to his marriage bed and his holy vows. But grief and war had worn Alfred down to something more human and more monstrous than the legend. 3 months after her capture, he came to her in the servants' quarters late one night, drunk on wine and melancholy, after burying another dozen men lost to Danish axes. She should have screamed. She should have fought. But something in his eyes that night, some desperate, broken thing, made her pause. And in that pause, he touched her face with surprising gentleness, and she found herself remembering that even monsters could weep. What happened next was neither rape nor seduction, but something more complicated, something that left them both stained with shame when dawn broke through the narrow window. He never came to her again. He avoided her eyes in the halls, treated her with the distant politeness one showed to furniture. But 2 months later, when her monthly courses failed to come and her belly began to swell beneath her servant's dress, Brida knew the truth that would destroy kingdoms if it ever came to light. She was carrying the king's bastard child, the secret daughter of Alfred the Great, and a Danish captive. She hid the pregnancy as long as she could, binding her belly tight, wearing loose clothing, avoiding the eyes of other servants. When the pains came early one winter morning, she delivered the child alone in the storage cellar, among sacks of grain and barrels of salted meat. A girl, small and perfect, with Alfred's sharp nose and Brida's dark hair. The baby drew one breath, maybe two, then went silent in her arms. No cry, no movement, just the terrible, infinite stillness of death. Brida had wrapped the tiny body in her own shawl and buried it in the kitchen garden that same night, her hands bloody from digging frozen earth, her tears freezing on her cheeks. She planted rosemary over the grave for remembrance, for the daughter who would never know her name. No one knew, no one ever asked. A Danish servant girl was beneath notice, beneath concern, beneath everything that mattered in Alfred's shining kingdom. That night, kneeling in the dirt over her daughter's grave, Brida made a vow that burned hotter than any fever, deeper than any wound. She would have her revenge on Alfred the Great. She would watch his kingdom crumble. She would see his legacy turn to ash. She didn't know how or when, but she swore by every god her people had ever prayed to that Alfred would pay for what he had taken from her. Her mother, her home, her innocence, and finally, her child. She was patient, she was careful. She wore her mask of servitude and waited for the gods to show her the way. The fever had taken Prince Edward to places no child should ever go. For 3 days and 3 nights, he lay suspended between life and death, his small body burning with a heat that made the physicians fear for his brain, for his very soul. They applied cold compresses that turned warm within moments. They bled him until his veins ran pale. They prayed until their voices grew hoarse, but still the fever raged on, and still the boy twisted and moaned in his sweat-soaked bed. On the third night, Edward's eyes rolled back in his head, and his body went rigid as iron. His mother, Queen Aethelflaed, clutched her rosary and wept. His sister, Aethelflaed, held his hand and refused to leave his side despite the physician's warnings about contagion. King Alfred stood at the window, staring out at the darkness, his own failing body, a cruel reminder that death played no favorites in royal houses. Then Edward began to speak, not in the babbling nonsense of fever dreams, but in clear, ringing tones that seemed to come from somewhere outside himself. "Two sisters," he said, his voice carrying an authority no 9-year-old should possess. "I see two sisters standing before a throne. One wears gold and carries a sword. The other wears grey and carries chains. But the crown..." His back arched off the bed, his small hands clawing at the air as if grasping for something invisible. "The crown knows its own. The crown remembers blood. The crown chooses the hidden one, the forgotten one, the one who was buried but did not die." Aethelflaed gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Queen Aethelflaed made the sign of the cross and backed away from the bed, her face white with terror. But Alfred moved closer, leaning over his son with an expression that mixed hope and dread in equal measure. "Edward," the king whispered, "what do you see? Tell me what the gods show you." The boy's golden eyes fixed on his father's face, and for a moment, something ancient and knowing looked out through that child's gaze. "You know, father. In your heart, you know. The daughter you denied, the seed you planted in conquered soil. She stands in shadows watching us, and the crown calls to her like iron to lodestone, one sister by marriage and law, one sister by blood and destiny. But only one can wear the crown, and the gods have chosen." Father Bioka, Alfred's most trusted priest, pushed forward through the assembled watchers. His clubfoot dragged across the floor as he approached the bed, his wrinkled face set in lines of stern disapproval. "This is devil's work," he declared, his voice shaking with conviction. "The fever has opened the boy's mind to dark spirits and false prophecies. We must perform an exorcism immediately. We must drive out these lying visions before they corrupt his immortal soul." Several other priests nodded in agreement, already reaching for their holy water and crosses. Bishop Erkenwald stepped forward, his heavy robes rustling. "The king has named his heir according to law and wisdom. Any vision that contradicts this is born of darkness, not light. The boy speaks madness, nothing more. When the fever breaks, he will remember none of this, and we will speak of it no more." But Alfred said nothing. He stared at his son with an expression that made Aethelflaed's blood run cold. It was the look of a man confronting a truth he had buried so deep he'd convinced himself it was a lie. His hands trembled as he backed away from the bed, and for just a moment, his mask of kingly composure cracked wide enough to reveal the terror beneath. In the corridor outside, Uhtred of Bebbanburg leaned against the cold stone wall with his arms crossed. The Danish-raised Saxon warrior had seen too many strange things in his long years of fighting to dismiss anything outright, but something about this situation made his warrior's instincts scream warnings. He had been summoned to Winchester for the succession announcement, had witnessed the chaos when Edward's condition worsened, and now he watched the parade of priests and nobles flowing in and out of the prince's chamber with growing unease. Uhtred's hand rested on the pommel of his sword, serpent breath, his scarred fingers drumming a restless pattern. He had learned long ago to trust his gut in matters of life and death, and his gut told him that something rotten festered at the heart of this crisis. The boy's words about two sisters, about hidden daughters and blood, denied they resonated with rumors he'd heard, whispered in taverns and camps. Stories about Alfred's raid 2 years ago, about captives taken and secrets buried. He pushed off from the wall and began walking toward the servants' quarters, following an instinct he couldn't name. Somewhere in this palace of stone and lies, there was a truth waiting to be uncovered. Somewhere, a secret breathed in the darkness, biding its time. And Uhtred had always been very good at finding secrets that powerful men wanted to keep hidden. The great hall of Winchester had never looked more magnificent or felt more heavy with expectation. Every torch blazed in its sconce, casting dancing shadows across the ancient tapestries that chronicled Saxon victories over Danish invaders. The stone floor had been scrubbed until it gleamed, covered in places with rushes scented with lavender and rosemary. Nobles from every corner of Wessex and beyond stood in their finest ceremonial dress, silk and velvet, in deep jewel tones, gold chains and silver brooches catching the firelight. Warriors wore polished armor over their formal tunics, their weapons peace-bonded but present, a reminder that power ultimately rested on steel. At the far end of the hall, upon a raised dais, King Alfred sat in his throne with his wife, Queen Ealhswith, beside him. The king looked more corpse than man now, his skin grey and papery, his once powerful frame reduced to little more than bones held together by royal vestments. But his eyes remained sharp, fixed on the procession forming before him with an intensity that made strong men look away. Aethelflaed walked forward through the parted crowd, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her like smoke. She wore a gown of deepest blue, embroidered with golden thread in patterns of Saxon crosses and protective runes. Her blonde hair had been braided with pearls and wound into an elaborate crown that would soon be replaced by one of actual gold. She was 23 years old, a widow, a warrior who had defended Mercia's walls when men cowered, and she carried herself with the dignity of someone who knew her own worth. Behind her walked the bishops and priests, Father Bjorka among them, their faces solemn as they prepared to consecrate a woman as ruler, an unprecedented act that had required months of theological debate and careful political maneuvering. They carried the ancient crown on a cushion of purple velvet, the gold and silver circlet that had rested on Saxon heads since before the days of written memory. Rubies and sapphires caught the torchlight, winking like stars. The crowd held its collective breath as Aethelflaed reached the dais and knelt before her father. Alfred's hands shook as he reached for the crown, lifting it from the cushion with visible effort. This was the moment 2 years of planning had built toward, the moment that would secure Wessex's future and bind the kingdom under a new kind of rule. By the grace of God and the will of the people, Alfred began, his voice barely carrying across the silent hall. I name thee, Aethelflaed, Lady of... The eastern doors exploded inward with a crash that made warriors reach for their swords and women cry out in alarm. Prince Edward stood in the doorway, swaying on his feet, his white sleeping gown hanging from his thin frame like a burial shroud. Blood streamed from his nose in twin crimson rivers that stained his chin and chest. His skin held the pallor of death itself, grey and waxy in the torchlight. He should not have been able to stand, much less walk. The physicians had given him hours at most, had prepared the family for his passing, but Edward stood, and Edward saw. And when he opened his mouth, the voice that emerged carried the weight of prophecy and doom. Not her. the words ripped from his throat like a physical thing, echoing off the stone walls with supernatural clarity. He lurched forward, his small body moving with jerking, puppet-like motions that suggested something other than his own will drove him. The gods showed me, not her. The hall erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted in confusion. Guards moved toward the boy, uncertain whether to restrain him or help him. Aethelflaed rose from her kneeling position, reaching toward her brother with tears already streaming down her face. But Edward was faster than he should have been, faster than any fevered child had right to be. He lunged at his sister with both hands extended, fingers grasping for the crown that hovered between Alfred's trembling hands and Aethelflaed's bowed head. His small body collided with his father's legs, and the impact was enough to send the ancient circlet flying from Alfred's grasp. The crown tumbled through the air, spinning end over end, catching and reflecting torchlight, until it seemed like a wheel of fire spinning through the hall. It hit the stone floor with a sound like thunder, the impact sending sparks of something that wasn't quite light cascading outward. The crown rolled, bouncing and spinning, past nobles who scrambled to get out of its path, as if it had become a living thing. It rolled past Bishop Erkenwald, who reached for it, and then pulled his hand back as if burned. It rolled past Uhtred, who watched its progress with narrowed eyes and a hand on his sword. It rolled through rushes and across bare stone, leaving a trail of that strange not light in its wake. And then it stopped. Dead center in its spinning, as if guided by invisible hands, the crown came to rest at the feet of a woman in a grey servant's dress. Brida stood frozen, a wine pitcher still clutched in her hands, her dark eyes wide with shock and something that might have been terror or triumph, or both. Edward pulled himself across the floor, his small hands clawing at the stone, leaving smears of blood from his nose. Aethelflaed reached for him, sobbing his name, but he didn't stop. He crawled like a wounded animal, dragging himself forward with single-minded purpose until his fingers closed around the crown. "Her," he whispered, and the word carried to every corner of the hall, despite its softness. "The gods crowned her in my dream. She is father's daughter. She is my sister. She is the one." With strength no dying child should possess, Edward lifted the crown. His arms shook with effort as he raised it toward Brida's dark hair. The servant woman stood paralyzed, her face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. The pitcher slipped from her fingers and shattered on the stone floor, wine spreading like blood across the rushes. The crown touched her hair, and the world exploded into light. Golden radiance blazed from the ancient metal, bright enough to make nobles shield their eyes, bright enough to cast shadows as sharp as noon sun. The light didn't come from the torches or from any earthly source. It poured from the crown itself, from the metal and jewels, from the very air around Brida's head. It was the light of recognition, of truth revealed, of destiny claiming what had always been its own. In that impossible brilliance, every person in the hall could see it, the resemblance hidden beneath a servant's humble bearing. Brida had Alfred's sharp nose, his high cheekbones, the same proud set to her jaw. The light revealed what servitude and prejudice had concealed, wrote the truth across her face in lines of gold and fire. The hall erupted. Warriors drew their swords with the ringing sound of steel on steel. Priests clutched their crosses and began shouting prayers and accusations of witchcraft. Nobles screamed questions and denials and curses. Queen Ealhswith collapsed in her throne, her ladies rushing to fan her pale face. And through it all, the light continued to blaze, impossible and undeniable, proclaiming a truth that would remake kingdoms. The golden light faded slowly, like the last rays of sunset bleeding from the sky. but the silence it left behind was more terrible than any storm. Every eye in the great hall fixed on King Alfred the Great, who sat upon his throne like a man facing Judgment Day. His face had gone from grey to bone white, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles stood out like mountain peaks beneath parchment skin. For a long moment, he seemed incapable of speech, incapable of movement, a statue of a king rather than a living man. Then his mouth opened, and the words that emerged carried the weight of kingdoms crumbling. "It is true." His voice cracked on the second word, broke entirely on the third. He tried again, forcing the confession past lips that trembled with shame and fear, and something that might have been relief. "God forgive me. It is true. The girl, the woman, Brida, she is my daughter, my blood, my sin made flesh." The hall exploded. It was as if Alfred's words had broken a dam that held back chaos itself. Noble lords shouted accusations and demands, their carefully maintained court composure shattered into 1,000 fragments. "Blasphemy!" Bishop Erkenwald's voice rose above the rest, his face purple with rage. "The king has defiled himself with a Danish whore. He has betrayed his marriage vows, his sacred duty, his very soul." Warriors argued among themselves, some calling for Brida's immediate execution as a Danish witch, others demanding answers about the succession, still others simply trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Women wept or prayed, or fainted into the arms of their companions. Servants pressed against the walls, desperate to be invisible while witnessing the most scandalous moment in living memory. But Alfred kept speaking, his voice growing stronger even as his body seemed to shrink further into his throne. 2 years ago, after the raid on the borderlands, I took captives. Among them was a girl, barely more than a child herself. I was drunk with grief and wine. My soul was sick with the weight of war and death. I went to her one night, and He stopped, swallowing hard. "I sinned. I betrayed my wife, my God, my kingdom, and from that sin came a child." Queen Eliswyth rose from her throne like a ghost ascending from a grave. Her face held no expression at all, which was somehow more terrifying than rage would have been. She moved toward her husband with slow, measured steps, and when she spoke, her voice could have frozen fire itself. "You told me she was barren. When I noticed her condition months after the raid, when I questioned you about the Danish girl who grew round with child, you swore to me on Christ's holy name that it was some other man's bastard. You swore it." Alfred's eyes filled with tears that spilled down his ravaged cheeks. "I lied. God help me. I lied to you, to the court, to myself. I convinced myself that if I never acknowledged her, if I treated the child as though it never existed, then perhaps it truly didn't. When the baby died. The baby died." Brida's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, sharp and lethal. She still stood where the crown had found her, but something had changed in her bearing. She no longer hunched like a servant accustomed to making herself small. She stood tall now, her shoulders back, her dark eyes blazing with a fury that had been banked for 2 years. "My daughter died because you gave me no midwife, no physician, nothing but cold stone and darkness to deliver your bastard into. She died because I was beneath your notice, beneath your care, beneath everything but your momentary lust." The words landed like blows. Alfred flinched with each one, but he did not look away from her face. Perhaps, after years of looking through her as if she were furniture, he finally forced himself to truly see her. Aethelflaed had not moved since her brother collapsed after placing the crown on Brida's head. She knelt beside Edward's small, unconscious form, her arms wrapped around him, but her eyes stared at nothing. Tears streamed down her face in silence, each one a piece of her breaking world. Everything she had believed about herself, about her place in the kingdom, about her father's wisdom and righteousness, all of it crumbled like sandcastles before the tide. "You named me heir," she whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the shouting that still filled the hall. "You spent 2 years preparing me to rule. You taught me statecraft and strategy. You told me I was worthy. And all that time, you knew. You knew there was another daughter, a truer daughter, one who carried your blood without question or legitimacy's blessing." Uhtred pushed through the crowd, his warrior's instinct screaming that this situation balanced on a knife's edge between revelation and bloodshed. He had seen men killed for far less than what Alfred had just confessed. He positioned himself near Brida, not quite protecting her but ready to intervene if the mob's shock turned to violence. Father Bioka clutched his cross so tightly the metal cut into his palms. "My lord king, this changes nothing. A bastard born of sin and a Danish captive cannot inherit. The laws are clear. The church is clear. Whatever sign the crown may have shown, whatever fevered visions the boy may have spoken, legitimacy matters, law matters. Aethelflaed is still the rightful heir." But even as the old priest spoke, his voice lacked conviction. Everyone in that hall had seen the light. Everyone had witnessed something that transcended law and legitimacy and human authority. The crown itself had chosen, and the crown, that ancient symbol of Saxon kingship, carried authority older than Christianity, older than written law, older than Alfred's kingdom itself. Alfred rose from his throne with tremendous effort, swaying on his feet like a tree in a storm. He looked at Aethelflaed, his legitimate daughter who had served him faithfully, who had earned every honor through blood and sacrifice. Then he looked at Brida, his secret shame, his buried sin, the daughter he had denied and ignored and tried to forget. Finally, he looked at his son, Edward, who lay unconscious on the cold stone floor, the instrument of divine revelation. "I have ruled for 30 years, Alfred said, his voice carrying despite its weakness. "I have fought Danes, and built burhs, and written laws, and tried to be worthy of the title history will give me. But in this moment, I am just a dying man who must choose between the daughter I raised and the daughter I abandoned, between law and prophecy, between the kingdom I built and the kingdom God demands." The hall fell silent, waiting for a king's final judgment. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Winchester, and the first drops of rain began to fall like tears from heaven itself. The rain hammered Winchester's stone walls like 1,000 fists demanding entry as night fell over the fractured kingdom. Alfred had been carried from the great hall to his chambers, his confession hanging in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The court had dispersed in chaos, nobles retreating to their quarters to whisper and plot, priests gathering in the chapel to pray or scheme depending on their nature. And Brida found herself locked in a tower room for her own protection, or so they claimed, with 2 guards posted outside her door. She stood at the narrow window, watching the rain, when the first assassin came. He wore no colors, no insignia, nothing to mark which noble house had sent him. He moved like smoke through the corridor, dispatching one guard with a knife to the throat before the man could cry out. The second guard's alarm died in a wet gurgle as steel found his windpipe. The assassin picked the lock with practiced ease, easing the door open on well-oiled hinges. But Brida was not the helpless servant he expected. 2 years of carrying wine pitchers had built deceptive strength in her arms, and 2 years of nursing hatred had taught her to sleep with one eye open. When he lunged for her, she met him with a heavy iron candlestick that caught him across the temple with a sickening crack. He went down hard, blood pooling beneath his hooded head, She was dragging the body toward the window, planning to dispose of it and disappear into the storm, when Uhtred kicked in the door with his sword drawn. The Danish raised warrior took in the scene with a glance the dead guards, the unconscious assassin, the Danish girl with murder in her eyes and blood on her hands. "Well," he said, lowering his sword slightly, "you're definitely Alfred's daughter." That's exactly how he would have handled it. Before Brida could respond, shouts echoed from the courtyard below. Torches moved through the rain like angry fireflies. Uhtred moved to the window and cursed under his breath. "Half the nobles in Winchester are arming their men. Some want you dead before sunrise. Others want to use you as a puppet queen they can control. And a few actually believe you're divinely chosen, which might be worse." In the East Wing, Ealdorman Aethelred of Mercia met with 3 other powerful lords in a chamber lit by a single guttering candle. He was a broad man with a cruel mouth and eyes that calculated profit in every situation. "Alfred's bastard changes everything," he growled, pouring wine with hands that trembled with rage or excitement. "If she takes the throne, we lose everything we've built. The Danes will rally to her. She'll undo every gain we've made." Lord Aethelwold, Alfred's nephew who had always believed himself the rightful heir, leaned forward eagerly. "Then we kill her. Tonight. Make it look like Danish sympathizers did it in revenge for Alfred's raids. We restore Aethelflaed to her rightful place, and everything continues as planned." "And if the crown truly chose her?" Bishop Wulfred asked quietly from the shadows. "If what we witnessed was God's will made manifest, who are we to stand against divine judgment?" Aethelred slammed his cup down hard enough to crack the wood beneath it. "I saw a fevered child and a clever trick of light, nothing more. The Danes are masters of sorcery. The girl probably practiced some heathen magic to create that glow. We act tonight, before she can consolidate support." But in another wing of the palace, a different conversation unfolded. Aethelflaed sat in her private chambers with her most trusted advisors, but she had sent them all away except for one person. Brida stood before her now, brought under heavy guard through secret passages, the 2 half-sisters facing each other for the first time as equals rather than lady and servant. "I should hate you," Aethelflaed said quietly, her red-rimmed eyes studying Brida's face with terrible intensity. "You've stolen everything I worked for, everything I believed I was meant to be. 2 years I've prepared to rule. 2 years of learning statecraft and strategy, of earning the respect of warriors and nobles who thought a woman could never lead. And in one moment, you've taken it all." Brida's expression remained hard, unreadable. "I stole nothing. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be born from your father's sin. I didn't ask for my daughter to die alone in darkness while you slept in silk and safety. My daughter died too." Aethelflaed's voice cracked. "Did you know that? 2 years ago, the same winter your child was born and died, I lost a son. He lived 3 days. 3 perfect days, and then God took him. So don't speak to me of loss as if you're the only one who knows its taste." The words hung between them, a bridge of shared grief spanning the chasm of their circumstances. For a moment, something softened in Brida's eyes, some recognition of common humanity beneath the layers of hatred and pain. But the moment shattered when Edward burst through the door, somehow escaped from his sickbed despite the physician's protestations. The boy looked like death itself, his skin translucent, his eyes still carrying that unnatural golden gleam. He stumbled between his sisters and fell to his knees, grasping both their hands with his small, burning fingers. "Please," he gasped, blood trickling again from his nose. "The gods showed me more. I saw England's future. If you fight each other, the Danes will sweep over us like a flood. If you divide the kingdom between you in civil war, everything father built will burn. But if you unite—" He coughed, and the sound rattled in his chest like stones in a cup. "If you rule together, if you bind Saxon and Dane into one kingdom, then England becomes something the world has never seen. 2 queens, 2 crowns, 1 kingdom." Aethelflaed stared at her brother as if he'd sprouted wings. "That's madness. No kingdom has ever been ruled by 2 women. The nobles would never accept it. The church would call it heresy." "Then let them call it heresy," Edward whispered, his voice fading. "Better heresy than ashes. Better madness than extinction. I've seen it, sister. I've seen both futures. Choose." He collapsed between them, unconscious once more, his small body spent from the effort of prophecy. The 2 women looked at each other over their brother's fallen form, daughters of the same father, inheritors of the same impossible choice. Outside, the assassins were gathering. The conspirators were plotting. The kingdom was fracturing along 1,000 fault lines, and dawn was still hours away. The storm battered Winchester's walls as if the heavens themselves raged at what unfolded within. Aethelflaed ordered the guards to carry Edward back to his chambers, then barred the door behind them, sealing herself alone with the half-sister she'd never known existed. 2 daughters of Alfred, separated by everything except blood, stood in the flickering candlelight and finally let their masks fall away. "Tell me about her," Aethelflaed said suddenly, her voice raw. "Your daughter, the one who died." Brida's head snapped up, suspicion flashing across her face. "Why? So you can feel superior? So you can remind me that your son at least had a proper burial while mine was planted in a kitchen garden like refuse?" "No." Aethelflaed moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. "Because I want to know if your pain felt like mine did. If you also woke up reaching for a child who wasn't there. If you also heard phantom cries in empty rooms." She turned, and tears glistened on her cheeks. "I want to know if grief is the same for a queen and a servant, or if somehow mine was less valid because I had silk sheets to weep into." The anger in Brida's eyes flickered, threatened to extinguish entirely. She wrapped her arms around herself as if holding her body together by force of will. She never even cried. She was so small, so perfect. I counted her fingers, her toes. She had your father's nose, my mother's chin, and then she just stopped, like a candle blown out. My son cried. Aethelflaed's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "For 3 days, he cried. The physicians said his lungs were too weak. They said he was fighting to stay, but his little body couldn't sustain the battle. I held him until he went quiet. I felt his last heartbeat against my chest." They stood in silence, 2 women who had birthed and buried children in the same terrible winter, never knowing they were sisters in grief as well as blood. The revelation settled between them like a shared wound, still raw, still bleeding. "I've hated your father for 2 years, Brida said finally. "Every morning I woke in the servants' quarters. I plotted his suffering. Every time I poured his wine, I imagined poison. Every time I saw him with you and Edward, playing the loving father, the righteous king, I wanted to scream the truth until the walls cracked." She laughed bitterly. "And now the truth is out, and I feel nothing. Just empty." Aethelflaed moved closer, her movements careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. "He used us both. You, he took by force and denied. Me, he molded into a weapon to secure his legacy. We were both just pieces on his game board, moved according to his plans, his needs, his vision of England's future." She met Brida's eyes directly. I spent 2 years believing I was special, chosen, worthy. But I was just convenient. A legitimate heir when he thought his bastard was safely buried and forgotten. The crown didn't think so. Brida touched her hair where the golden light had blazed, her expression troubled. Whatever that was, God or magic or madness, it chose me. But I don't know how to be a queen. I can barely read. I know nothing of statecraft or warfare, or any of the things you've been trained for since birth. And I know nothing of what the common people truly need, Aethelflaed admitted. I've lived my entire life behind palace walls. I've led armies but never scrubbed a floor. I've made laws but never felt their weight on my own back. She paused, her next words coming slowly, painfully. Edward said we should rule together. 2 queens, 1 kingdom. It sounds insane. It is insane, Brida agreed. The nobles will revolt. The church will condemn us. Your mother will probably try to have me executed. Probably. Aethelflaed almost smiled, though it was a broken, fragile thing. But if we fight each other, if we tear this kingdom apart fighting for a crown neither of us truly wanted until today, then the Danes will sweep over us like a tide. Everything our father built for better or worse will turn to ash. Brida crossed to the table, where wine waited in a silver pitcher. She poured 2 cups with hands that had served 1,000 nobles, then offered one to Aethelflaed with a gesture that was neither servant nor equal but something new, undefined. I can't forgive him. I won't. What he did to my mother, to me, to my daughter, that debt can never be repaid. Aethelflaed took the cup, her fingers brushing Brida's for just a moment. I can't forgive him either, for lying to my mother, for using me, for being less than the legend I believed in. She raised her cup in a toast that felt more like a funeral rite. To Alfred the Great, who built a kingdom on the backs of women he betrayed. To Alfred the Damned, Brida countered, who thought he could bury his sins and call it righteousness. They drank together as thunder shook the walls, and somewhere in the darkness, assassins sharpened their blades and plotted the deaths of queens. The war horns sounded at dawn, their mournful wail cutting through the storm like the cry of dying gods. Brida and Aethelflaed had barely slept, still sitting in the chamber where they'd forged their tentative alliance, when Uhtred burst through the door with his sword already drawn and blood splattered across his face. Danes, he gasped, his chest heaving. 300 warriors, maybe more. They must have been camped just beyond the hills, waiting. Someone sent them word about the chaos in Winchester, about Alfred's condition, about the succession crisis. His eyes found Brida's face. They're calling for you. They know you're Danish-born. They think you'll open the gates and welcome them as liberators. Aethelflaed was already moving, strapping on her sword belt with the practiced efficiency of a warrior who defended Mercia's walls. How long until they reach the gates? An hour, maybe less if they run. Uhtred wiped blood from his cheek, not his own, Brida noted. Half our garrison is scattered throughout the city, trying to contain the noble conspiracies. The other half is confused about who they're supposed to be protecting. Some think Brida's the rightful queen, others want her dead, and most are just terrified of what that golden light meant. He looked between the 2 women. We need a unified command. We need someone to lead, or Winchester falls before midday. Brida felt ice water flood her veins. Her mother's face flashed through her mind. Danish features, Danish pride, Danish blood spilled by Saxon steel during Alfred's raids. Those warriors outside the walls were her people, or they had been once, before chains and captivity, and a king's sin had remade her into something neither Danish nor Saxon. They came to rescue her, to crown her, to use her as a weapon against the man who'd destroyed her village and stolen her life. She could open the gates. She could let them pour through Winchester's streets like a flood, watch them burn Alfred's palace, slaughter his nobles, tear down everything he'd built. Her revenge, served on a platter of fire and blood. Her mother would be avenged. Her daughter's death would mean something. But then she thought of Edward, lying fevered and dying in his chambers, that strange boy who'd seen visions of two queens united. She thought of Aethelflaed, who'd lost a son in the same winter Brida lost a daughter, who'd been used by their father just as surely as Brida had been. She thought of the servants who'd slept beside her in the quarters, who'd shared their meager bread when she first arrived in chains, who had no power to choose their king or queen, but would die just the same when Danish axes fell. "They're not coming to save me," Brida said quietly, her voice cutting through Uhtred's urgent tactical assessment. "They're coming to use me. Another man's weapon, another man's tool. I've spent 2 years being invisible in Alfred's palace, but at least I belonged to myself. If I open those gates, I become their puppet instead of his." A tremendous crash shook the palace as something heavy slammed against Winchester's outer gates. Shouts and screams rose from the city below. Smoke began to curl into the grey morning sky. They were already burning the outer buildings, driving terrified citizens toward the inner walls. Aethelflaed gripped her sword hilt, her knuckles white. "I've commanded soldiers before, but never with half my garrison ready to mutiny. I need someone the common fighters will follow, someone who can give orders without worrying about noble politics or church approval." She looked at Brida with an expression that was half plea, half challenge. "I need a sister who knows what it's like to fight for survival instead of glory." Another horn blast, closer now. The Danes were at the inner gates. Below in the courtyard, Brida could hear confused shouts as Saxon warriors tried to organize a defense without clear leadership. Some called for Aethelflaed. Others demanded to know if they were defending a Danish witch or a rightful heir. Most just sounded terrified. In his chambers, Edward began to seize again, his small body convulsing, foam flecking his lips. The physicians sent for both his sisters, their message desperate. The boy was dying, truly dying this time, and he called for them both with his last breaths. Brida stood at the window, torn between 3 impossible choices. She could flee into the chaos, disappear into the countryside, become invisible again. She could open the gates and embrace the revenge she'd nursed for 2 years like a poisonous flower. Or she could stay and fight for a kingdom built on her suffering, defend a father who'd denied her, protect a people who'd enslaved her. The crown that cursed, blessed thing sat on a table where Uhtred had placed it for safekeeping. In the growing light of dawn, it seemed to pulse with a faint golden glow, as if waiting to see what she would choose, as if destiny itself held its breath. "Where are the armories?" Brida asked, her voice steady despite the fear flooding her limbs. "If I'm going to fight, I'll need a sword." The armory smelled of oil and iron and old blood. Brida's hands trembled as she lifted a sword lighter than she expected, the balance perfect, as if it had been waiting for her grip. Aethelflaed helped her strap on leather armor, their movements quick and efficient, no words needed. 2 daughters of Alfred, arming for war against the enemies at their gates. "You've never held a sword in battle," Aethelflaed said, not as a question but a statement of fact that carried no judgment. "I've held a knife to gut fish and a poker to tend fires," Brida replied, testing the weight of the blade with awkward swings. "How different can it be?" "Enormously different." Aethelflaed caught Brida's wrist, adjusting her grip. "But you won't be fighting alone. Stay close to me. Watch my back, I'll watch yours." They emerged into the courtyard, to find chaos incarnate. Saxon warriors milled about in confusion, some forming shield walls, others arguing about who commanded them, still others simply frozen in terror as the sounds of battle grew closer. The gates shuddered under repeated impacts, the iron-reinforced wood beginning to splinter. Danish war cries echoed through the streets beyond promises of glory and plunder and revenge. Brida climbed onto the mounting block near the well, her servant's dress billowing beneath the borrowed armor. She opened her mouth to speak and found no words, no idea how to command warriors who'd never seen her as anything but furniture. But then she felt it, a warmth spreading from her chest outward, a tingling sensation that ran down her arms to her fingertips. The crown, still in the palace above, seemed to pulse in response to her need. When she spoke, her voice carried across the courtyard with impossible clarity, resonating with harmonics that raised the hair on every neck. "I am Brida, daughter of Alfred, chosen by the crown you all witnessed. The Danes at our gates think I will betray you because I share their blood. They're wrong. I was born Danish, yes, but I was remade by fire and grief and survival in this city. Winchester is my home now, whether I wanted it or not, and no one burns my home." The warriors stared at her, uncertain, until Aethelflaed stepped onto the block beside her, their shoulders touching. "I am Aethelflaed, also daughter of Alfred, defender of Mercia. This woman is my sister not by choice, not by love, but by blood, and now by oath. We stand together, or we fall divided. Choose." The gates exploded inward with a crash that shook the foundations. Danish warriors poured through the breach like a human flood, axes raised, faces painted with symbols of their gods. At their head rode Jarl Heisten, a scarred veteran of 100 raids, his eyes alight with the promise of Winchester's wealth and England's crown offered to whoever could seize it. But he stopped short when he saw the two women standing side by side, one blonde and regal, one dark and fierce, both radiating something that made his horse shy sideways in sudden fear. The crown's power, still building in the palace above, manifested as visible golden light that wreathed both sisters like flame. It poured down from the windows where the crown rested, splitting into two streams that crowned both women with impossible radiance. "Sorcery!" Haston spat, but his voice carried uncertainty. Behind him, his warriors hesitated, their courage faltering before something that transcended the normal rules of battle and blood. The Saxon warriors, seeing their leaders crowned in light, found their courage. With a roar that shook the walls, they charged. Brida found herself swept into the tide of combat, her untrained swings wild but effective in the close quarters. Aethelflaed fought beside her with the practiced efficiency of a warrior queen, her blade singing as it cut through Danish shields and found flesh beneath. The battle compressed into moments of brutal clarity. Brida saw a Danish warrior with her mother's eyes and hesitated. He didn't, and his axe would have split her skull if Uhtred hadn't appeared from nowhere to drive his sword through the man's throat. She saw Aethelflaed take a glancing blow to her shoulder, but keep fighting, blood streaming down her arm, her face set in lines of absolute determination. She saw Saxon and Dane fall together, their blood mixing on Winchester's stones in a pattern that looked almost like prophecy. And through it all, the golden light burned brighter. It wasn't just illumination, it was power made visible, destiny asserting itself against the chaos of mortal will. Warriors on both sides began to see it, began to understand that they fought not just against soldiers, but against something older and more terrible than any human army. In his chambers above the battle, Edward's eyes snapped open. The golden light that had been draining from his body since his vision now reversed its flow, pouring back into him from the crown that blazed like a star in the adjacent room. His fever broke in an instant, sweat cooling on his skin as color returned to his cheeks. He sat up, weak but alive, and whispered words that only the gods could hear. Thank you for showing them the way." Haston saw his moment slipping away. He'd expected a divided city, ripe for conquest. Instead, he found something unprecedented: two queens crowned in divine light, fighting side by side, rallying warriors who should have been at each other's throats. He made the calculation that had kept him alive through decades of warfare. This battle was lost before it began. "Fall back!" His command carried across the courtyard, cutting through the clash of steel. "This place is cursed. The gods have spoken." The Danish warriors needed no further encouragement. They retreated through the shattered gates, their orderly withdrawal becoming a rout as the golden light seemed to pursue them, growing brighter with each step they took away from the crowned sisters. Silence fell over Winchester like a benediction. Bodies lay scattered across the courtyard, Danish and Saxon both, their feuds ended in death's democracy. Brida stood gasping for breath, her borrowed sword red to the hilt, her arms shaking with exhaustion and shock. Beside her, Aethelflaed swayed on her feet, her wounded shoulder bleeding freely but her eyes clear and fierce. The golden light faded slowly, gently, like a blessing withdrawn but not revoked. The warriors who remained standing looked at their queens, both of them, crowned by gods and proven in battle, and slowly, one by one, they knelt,